Well, the defense has rested its case, so to speak, and the only thing that has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt is that there is no impeachable conduct here. That's very clear and has been from the very beginning, and the impeachment defense team put on an ironclad case that anyone who looks at this objectively will understand with the evidence, everything that's been argued and presented. The thing that sticks out to me as a constitutional law attorney is what has been emphasized over and over the last couple of days, and that is the bar that has been set, the low bar, the new standard that the Democrats have now set for the country is, as Jay Sekulow just said repeatedly, echoes danger, danger, danger for all of us. This is a scary new precedent. The Democrats have opened a Pandora's box, and from now on, anything apparently that is politically unpopular can become the ground for an impeachment charade like we've seen today. Heaven help us when the next president in the White House has a majority party from the other side. The base will demand an impeachment. That's where we are now. That's where this goes. I'll let you hear from our other colleagues.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing the closing statement by White House counsel Pat Cipollone. It is very clear that Adam Schiff has presented the weakest case in our nation's history when it comes to impeachment. As you heard from Jay Sekulow, we heard part of the story from Adam Schiff, who took testimony out of context and didn't provide the fulsome facts. What you heard from the president's defense team were those facts that are important to get across to the American public. One, there was widespread concern about corruption in Ukraine. Jay pointed out that it wasn't until September 7th that the High Court was finalized in Ukraine to tamp down on that corruption. Number two, there were concerns about Hunter Biden's role on the board of Burisma. We heard that in Ambassador Yovanovitch's testimony during the Obama administration. Widespread concerns. Number three, not a single witness testified that they have direct evidence of impeachable offenses, high crimes, misdemeanors, bribery, or treason. So the facts, despite the fact that we are 70 plus days into this, the facts have remained the same in that Ukraine received the aid, in fact more aid than during the Obama administration, in the form of anti-tank missiles, Javelins, which Jay noted that 3 of the Democrats opposed. I think it is important, and I supported that increased security assistance. And the second key fact is there was no investigation into the Bidens. So the facts remain the same. The American people understand this. They want to get beyond this very partisan impeachment. And this is a very dangerous precedent that has been set for future Congresses when you have divided government. I will turn it over to my colleague, Lee Zeldin from New York.
Well, the House impeachment managers were speaking. They said 1,000 times over, no one is above the law. But in their articles of impeachment, they don't accuse the president of violating any law. And the Senate chamber has been hijacked all of last week. We're seeing it hijacked all of this week. And if you ask our constituents, what do you want us to be doing to fight for you down in Washington? If I went house to house to house to house in my district right now, so what do you want to see Congress doing on your behalf? They're going to talk about the cost of prescription drug prices. They're going to talk about finding a job to be able to pay your bills, lowering energy costs. They care about health care. They want to see Republicans and Democrats working together to get an infrastructure package. This is not the priority of my constituents as I go door to door to door. And it's not the priority of America. It's the priority of people who have been trying to take down the president since he was elected. But to think that articles of impeachment will come over here and hijack the Senate the way it has, and they say 1,000 times over, no one's above the law, and they don't even accuse the president of breaking any law. It's time to move on, and it's time to move forward. And I'll leave you with this. Just imagine what would happen in our country if you play this out. Not just long term, not just the next time that you have a Republican House with a Democratic president and this new lowered standard. What happens the next day? I care about our republic. My background's in the military. I still serve in the Army Reserve. I was in Iraq with the 82nd Airborne Division. Elise represents Fort Drum. We have people who go overseas for their 10th deployment. They might have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old at home. Why do they make that sacrifice? Why are they willing to lay down their life for our flag, for our freedoms, for our liberty, for our Constitution? We're willing to risk it all, not just for friends and family, but for strangers. All of you, as patriots, regardless of whether you're in Congress, you're a member of the media, or you're watching at home, think about what this means for America the next day. It's time to move on. Happy to answer any questions you have.
What did you hear from the President's Defense Counsel that disproves the quid pro quo by the President?
Well, so first off, the burden of proof is not on the President to prove his innocence. Now, there are many members of the House who said that the President is guilty until he proves his innocence. That's not the American way. But the very first person who came to testify gave a transcribed interview, former Special Envoy Ukraine, Kurt Volker. And if you go right back to his deposition, his transcript to start this whole thing off, he said that the readouts from Ukraine and the U.S. after the July 25th call make no reference to quid pro quo or a hold on aid. That the next day on July 26th, Kurt Volker meets with President Zelensky and there's no reference to quid pro quo or a hold on aid. For weeks that follow, with all of the contacts between Ambassador Volker and President Zelensky and his top aides, there's no reference to quid pro quo or a hold on aid. And not just Kurt Volker, and Bill Taylor, and George Kent, and others, the people who are actually in touch with President Zelensky and his top team, they all say that President Zelensky didn't know that there was a hold on aid until after reading it in Politico at the very end of August. The hold on aid gets released shortly thereafter, and Ukraine didn't have to do anything new in order to get that hold on aid lifted. These facts were actually the very first facts that we learned with the very first witness in front of Adam Schiff.
Congressman, the Republicans have said that none of those witnesses that you heard in the House were in the room with the President or ever had a conversation with the President. So why don't they want to hear from people like John Bolton who have been in the Oval Office, have been directly in these conversations?
Yeah, no, actually, Ambassador Volker did have direct conversations with the President of the United States, and to that point, one other. Well, let me just answer it because Ambassador Volker has, he did speak, but on top of that, going back to the fall of 2017, President Trump was directly expressing his concern to Ambassador Volker of the need to fight corruption in Ukraine. Were you about to say something?
There's another example I wanted to add on what Lee said. Ambassador Sondland, in fact, testified about his direct conversations with the President, and he quoted the President as saying, I want nothing, no conditionality. So the premise of your question is wrong. It's not based on the facts. Many of the witnesses had direct conversations with the President, Volker and Sondland. I'm just saying your question is wrong, and it's important to get it right for your readers and for your listeners.
Right. A lot of Democrats are saying, though, that you want to hear from more witnesses who've been in those conversations.
We have heard from, you want to answer?
I would just say one of the things that's just outrageous is people saying that there are no witnesses. If there are no witnesses, what just happened with 3 days of the House impeachment managers? And then the 3 days of the President's counsel. I saw all these videos on the screen of these people answering questions of members of the House, people who were sworn into oath to answer questions. What do we call those people? They're witnesses. There were a lot of people who testified, and their testimony is being presented to the Senate. And unfortunately, for the case that the House impeachment managers are providing, it falls woefully short. Now, the person who asked us the question isn't even here. She left in the middle of us answering it.
She had her facts wrong.
Are they the question? They are witnesses in the House, though, not in the Senate. Are they the same?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll play along with that for a moment. Let's just say, playing along with your question, that the witnesses in the House are not witnesses in the Senate. How striking is it to you that the very best witnesses that Adam Schiff has to call are absolutely none of the people he called in the House? Just think about that. Just how weak is your case? If you remember the first day when we got here at the start of the impeachment trial, we spent 11 hours. Well, let me go back one step before that. On the floor of the House of Representatives, before sending the impeachment articles, Jerry Nadler said that he proved the case, quote, beyond a doubt. They all said the facts were uncontested, indisputable, and overwhelming. But the first day that we came here for the Senate, they spent 11 hours telling you point by point by point by point everything that they still needed in order to prove their case. But if I played along with your question and said that all of those witnesses, let's just forget about all the videos that the House impeachment managers played of witnesses and all the videos that the President's counsel played of witnesses, I think it tells you a lot about Adam Schiff's case and how weak it is. If he wants to declare that his best witnesses are people who he has absolutely no idea what they're going to say, that tells you a lot about that rushed, corrupt, rigged process where they were racing against the clock to impeach the president by Christmas. Remember, they never sent a subpoena to John Bolton. There was a subpoena to Charles Kupperman. And when Judge Leon said an expedited case to decide that, the executive versus legislative branch subpoena issue, what did Adam Schiff do? And this is great news, right? Judge Leon said an expedited schedule will decide by December or January. Adam Schiff decided, with lost interest, to withdraw the subpoena and file a motion to dismiss. And that was the Charles Kupperman subpoena. As far as John Bolton, there wasn't even a subpoena. Any other questions?
Congressman, so DOD certified this money in May. They said that Ukraine met all anti-corruption standards. So what specifically happened that made the president all of a sudden concerned about corruption? What specific corruption was he chasing at that?
That's a great question. I'll point out a few things. First off, a lot of the witnesses were talking about a lot of corruption issues that they were working on directly with the Ukraine government. It was a consensus of everyone who works Ukraine policy for the United States government, not just people who are political appointees, but also career officials in the United States government, all concerned about corruption in Ukraine. It is the top issue in Ukraine, going back whether it was past administrations, the current administration right now in Ukraine, past administration Ukraine. 2014, we passed the Ukraine Security Assistance Act. You can't even provide United States tax dollars to Ukraine unless you're convinced at that moment. Let me finish the answer, please. And I'll get right back to you. Unless you're convinced that at that moment that Ukraine is doing what it needs to do to fight corruption. And in the NDAA, it was reinforced, you can't provide US tax dollars to Ukraine unless at that moment you're confident that they're fighting corruption. It is actually in law a responsibility of the President of the United States, and a lot happened specifically since May. So you pointed out May.
What specifically happened since May? Yeah.
Well, first off, so you have a whole new administration that's coming in.
You have on an anti-corruption platform.
You have to let me answer your questions.
I'm just saying, anti-corruption platform.
That's fantastic.
Go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Okay.
Like
So after you have, and listen, if I give a good answer, that doesn't mean that you have to cut me off. Okay. I know that if I give a bad answer, you'd probably let me go all day. I understand now. This is our second day. Right. Well, let me answer you.
Go ahead.
So after the May, after that May timeframe, so you have a new person who comes into the administration, and then you have parliamentary elections, and in that new parliamentary elections, they end up passing new laws into the hundreds in Ukraine in order to fight corruption in Ukraine, and you stand up new entities with new responsibilities, new initiatives of President Zelensky, and all of the new stuff that he did, whether it was the parliamentary election or all the new initiatives that President Zelensky said he wanted to initiate, as we just heard on the House floor, and Jay Sekulow did a fantastic job laying it out, it actually wasn't even until September 5th that you saw the new court even stand up. So if you look at the actual record of the parliamentary elections, and you didn't know who was going to win the parliamentary elections, and it turned out it was President Zelensky's party, to all the new initiatives that passed specifically to fight corruption. And on top of that, what you saw right up until September 5th, just before then, and that's the corruption issue, which is on top of the burden sharing issue. And one last alibi, with regards to that September 1st meeting that Vice President Pence had with President Zelensky, if you go back to the testimony, the deposition of Ambassador Taylor, President Trump sent Vice President Pence to Warsaw to meet with President Zelensky September 1st to talk about two things. And Ambassador Taylor said that those 2 points that he was sent for, and specifically the point about fighting corruption, was perfectly in line with U.S. law and U.S. policy. But what needs to be known when you're looking at Ambassador Sondland's account of that September 1st meeting, Andre Yermak gave an interview on December 4th. It was in a December 10th story in Time magazine. And in that story, Andre Yermak totally refutes Ambassador Sondland's account of that September 1st meeting. Any other questions?
Biden, CrowdStrike, and what is the other specific corruption?
So,
You still
you know, as
haven't
far as,
mentioned anything.
listen, I mean, yesterday, by the way, anyone else have any other questions? I'd be happy to answer
I
this
know
one.
it's a hard question, but it's
Oh, no,
important.
no, hold on a second.
It's a hard
Hold on.
question because
Out of-
the president's not on the record mentioning anything
out of
other than
respect-
Biden, CrowdStrike. That's it, and you haven't mentioned anything else.
Okay, I'm happy to answer your question,
Please.
but all I was asking was, because you have a lot of colleagues here, all
You
I
guys
was,
want the answer, right?
that
They
okay,
did.
I'm happy to,
you.
but just know, you have a unique style, okay? And it's one that might not be as, I mean, you're not looking around to see if anyone else has any other questions. But if you
You're
want,
not answering it.
I will add
okay,
to what he said.
listen, first off, you had a lot of testimony yesterday from, you heard great remarks from Pam Bondi, from Eric Hirschman, going into the details as it relates to Burisma and the Bidens.
Yep.
The fact that you have a corrupt Ukrainian gas company run by a corrupt Ukrainian oligarch hiring the son of the sitting vice president with no energy experience and no Ukraine experience solely by his own admission for his last name. At least $50,000 a month. Now, during that, the vice president, who happens to be the most conflicted person out in the Obama administration to be running point for Ukraine, ends up threatening Ukraine with the loss of $1 billion if they don't fire their prosecutor. Now, Hunter Biden,
most of our allies felt the same way, though.
He spoke on behalf of the international community.
if you
on
guys,
that.
listen, media, if you all would like to, I mean, you're doing a great job as Shills. If you ask a
insult us
question,
because we're asking you tough questions.
but you,
sir.
this is the
We're
problem.
not insulting
the
you.
problem
Don't
is
insult
that the
us.
problem is that you're actually insulting your audience.
No, I'm not. I'm asking
Because-
questions that people want answered.
Besides
Yeah, here's-
Biden and CrowdStrike, what other corruption?
So
were
with
they
regards to
investigating?
Ukrainians in the 2016 election, because there's a lot of focus on what something Fiona Hill said that just wasn't true. She's saying that if you're concerned about Ukrainians interfering in the 2016 election, then that means that you believe that Russia had no role interfering in the 2016 election. And that was an insult to all of the House Republicans who are on the Intelligence Committee who worked really hard on their report, specifically with regards to Russians interfering in the 2016 election. Now, with regards to Ukrainians in the 2016 election, you have several points they're indisputable. Now look at Ken Vogel's reporting in Politico from January of 2017 because he covered a lot of it. Ambassador Chali's op-ed. You have Avakov's anti-Trump statements. You have Alexandra Chalupa working with the Ukrainian embassy to dig up dirt on the Trump campaign. You have the Black Ledger that was used to take down a Trump campaign official. You have testimony before the House
He's in
of a
jail now,
Ukrainian
too.
who is,
Paul Manafort's in
I
jail for
actually,
financial crimes.
if you like, I'll just step aside.
You know what? We have
The
to
bottom line
correct-
is,
we
let
have
me
to
answer. Let me
correct
give you a simple answer.
misinformation
Let me
in
give you a
real
simple
time.
answer.
It's time.
The-
for us
the-
to correct
the bottom
misinformation
line
is-
in real time.
What was
Is a
untrue?
negative comment about a world leader interference in an election because there's 60 different officials from foreign countries.
Here's
who
all you
make
need to know about it.
negative
Let me give you the
comments
answer to the
about
question.
President Trump.
The
That
DO
is-
wait a
that is
minute.
not
I'm going to answer it for you. I'm going to answer it for you.
Russian interference.
The president is elected by the people of this country to be the commander-in-chief. The DOD said, we think it's okay. It doesn't matter necessarily what the DOD says unless the commander-in-chief agrees. President Trump had a great concern about Ukraine for all the reasons that have been cited, and I think for the reasons that most of the American people can understand. They were ranked as the #3 most corrupt nation in the world.
Then why not do
Wait a
something
minute,
3 years
Zelensky
ago?
ran on a platform not unlike Donald Trump as a reformer, as someone who would drain the swamp, so to speak, in Ukraine. The president wanted to make sure that that was legitimate. Once he was convinced of that, once he had the opportunity to meet and talk with Zelensky, he was convinced of that fact, and that's when the aid was released. And that's one of the facts that cannot change, no matter who testifies and what is said. Everyone knows that the aid was released, that the Ukrainian officials didn't really know about it until July, until all this came out. and that there was no quid pro quo. There was no condition on the money. Everyone said that. The top 4 witnesses, again, are the president, the vice president of our country, Zelensky, and his officials, and they are all clear about the facts.
I will cite the actual testimony, which you should know. Every single ambassador that testified, everyone who worked in our embassy at Ukraine gave examples of corruption. Corruption was widespread in their elections, corruptions in terms of their financial institutions and Ukrainian banks, corruption in companies like Burisma. So there are ample examples of concerns of corruption, so much so that on the Bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act, we required there be anti-corruption efforts, which Republicans and Democrats voted for, except for 3. I'm talking about. I've cited testimony by our ambassadors that served prior to May and September.
So what specific investigations were underway that you guys were conducting between May and September?
As we said all along, there was no official investigation into the Bidens. So you should get your facts straight.
That's
your
what I'm saying.
The question that you
You've
asked
given
me,
us nothing under the
question
Bidens,
that you asked me
Burisma,
was
and
about
CrowdStrike.
corruption. The question that you asked me was about corruption, and I'm going to answer that question. Every witness that testified under oath that was asked about corruption testified that Ukraine has rampant corruption problems in their government, and that was one of the reasons why Zelensky was elected. September 5th or September 7th, I may have the date wrong, was when the High Court was put into place to crack down on corruption. But the premise of your question is wrong, because there are ample examples of corruption. Do you ignore the testimony of ambassadors? Do you ignore the testimony of ambassadors?
If there's a certification, then there must be some kind of answer to what changed.
Zelensky had to form a cabinet.
Zelensky
had to form a cabinet. There had to be
that's not
parliamentary.
corruption.
Yes. To form a government that ran on anti-corruption efforts, Zelensky had to form the cabinet. There had to be parliamentary elections. They had to put the High Court in place. That wasn't done until early September, and then the aid was released before the end of the fiscal year. So the premise of your question is wrong.
So
Every witness has testified that there was long
investigation. He was just waiting to see who was
Next
on his
question.
cabinet.
This is ridiculous. You need to go back and listen to the testimony. Every single witness has testified. Well, what did the witnesses say about corruption in Ukraine?
Corruption is a problem, and it
Exactly.
has been in Ukraine throughout its history.
Which is why there's
However,
bipartisan support for the National
Zelensky
Defense
and
Act.
Rob Portman, who's the Ukraine caucus chair.
All right, everybody, I know that things are getting pretty heated here between the senators and this reporter who appears to be wearing an NBC News lanyard, but the Senate impeachment trial has resumed, so I'm going to take you back out there live now, right here on Fox News Now.
That I think are instructive, as I said last night. They're instructive because they were right then and they're right now. And I'll leave you with some of those words.
There must never be a narrowly voted impeachment or an impeachment supported by one of our major political parties and opposed by the other. Such an impeachment will produce the divisiveness and bitterness in our politics for years to come and will call into question the very legitimacy of our political institutions.
This is unfair to the American people. By these actions, you would undo the free election that expressed the will of the American people in 1996. In so doing, you will damage the faith the American people have